Charles.
I feel like a double imposter here. One, I'm not an Oberlin grad, and two, as I think most of us have been saying, the last thing in the world I would have identified myself as an entrepreneur. I mean, looking back, I suppose I fit some of those categories, but I think the reason it strikes me as bizarre is that I've basically had 3 careers. I'm in my 3rd now with classical action, which I'll explain in a minute. But I've sort of fallen into all of them. I was never particularly prepared in any kind of academic way or any training way for any of these careers. My first career right out of college was I was a French teacher. I'd grown up actually as a musician. I was a cellist, a pianist, played quite a lot through college. Everybody thought I was a music major, which I wasn't. I think everybody assumed I was going to be going into music as a career, which I didn't, except from other vantage points. And right out of college, I was offered, not worth going into all the details, but I was offered a job teaching French at a boarding school in New Hampshire. And I had majored in French, loved it, and I did that for 5 years, moved to France for a year, moved to Buffalo, New York, where I taught for 6 more years. And when I was in Buffalo, on the side, I was a French teacher, but I created a chamber music series at the school where I taught just because I loved playing chamber music. It wasn't really much more complicated than that. I had friends in the Buffalo Philharmonic. I had friends who were studying with the Cleveland Quartet who had just moved to Buffalo at the time. It was Michael Tilson Thomas had just come to be the conductor of the Buffalo Philharmonic. It was kind of an exciting time, but it wasn't my field. It was sort of things I did on the side and got a charge out of. But it was when I was there that there was a program back in those days called the Affiliate Artists, which brought professional performers to various parts of the country to do a lot of outreach programs. And a woman that came to Buffalo for 2 years in a row for several weeks out of those years was a wonderful singer named Hilda Harris. And by a wonderful twist of fate for me, I ended up being her accompanist for a lot of those outreach programs. They were never in a traditional concert hall. We were at Attica Prison, we were at homes for the aged, we were in inner city schools, we were in, Boy Scout troops, whatever. But it was a huge, had a huge influence on me for 2 reasons. One, I realized that this woman who sang at the Met Opera, she sang at City Opera, she had a career all over the world, and this was anything but that. And Hilda never, ever gave less than 100%, always. It didn't matter where she was. She could have been on the stage of the Met Opera because it was that important to her. And that had a really profound influence on me because it was real. It wasn't pretend. And I think one of the things that struck me was that audiences can tell that, or people. Audiences may be too strong a word at this point, but they understand that kind of commitment and that sort of allegiance to making music in this case. While I was finishing up teaching there, Hilda and another friend of hers sort of made this crazy suggestion to me. They said, Charlie, have you ever thought about being an agent? And I, to a certain extent, was a musician, and agents was like, don't mention that word in front of me. But they said something, we need people like you in the business, and for reasons which I've never been able to explain in any coherent way, I left my teaching job in Buffalo, moved to New York. This is now 30 years ago. And with this ridiculous idea of starting my own, becoming a concert manager. And I moved to New York. I didn't know a single person there, literally. I knew Hilda, and I think I knew one other person. And I say this because, and Bill would appreciate this being in that business now, I remember Hilda gave me a copy of Musical America, which some of you may know is like this huge compendium of everything to do with the professional music scene in the country, orchestras and choruses and managers and artists and so forth. And I remember looking at this thinking, I don't know a single person in here, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of concert presenters in this. And I really remember, maybe I'm fabricating this, but I seem to remember thinking, all right, I have 2 options. I have other teaching jobs I could go back to, or I'll just start meeting people. And obviously I took the second option. And now, looking back, it strikes me as sort of funny because it's been the world I've been in for so long now, but there really was a time when I didn't know the first thing about it. But when you're starting at that stage, you just take the next step. And the next step right then was to book myself a little tour in New England and meet some people. And those people introduced me to some more people, and then it started mushrooming bit by bit over the years. But it was sort of intoxicating for me. It was also, talking about hard times, I moved to New York. I think I'd saved $1,000, which I was a teacher. That seemed like a lot of money to me. It was gone, I think, in a week, you know. And as a manager, as you probably would know, you make money only if you're going to book an artist and you get a commission from that date. Well, I had no artists. I had no dates. I had no source of income, really, for several years, which just meant borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and borrowing from you and then borrowing for you to pay him back and borrowing for you to pay him back. And that's a whole story, which I won't go into now. But it was interesting that somehow it was seat of my pants, 11th hour crises. Somehow, magically, something would always happen. And I'll give you just one example because it's the kind of thing that kept me going in those years. There was a particular Sunday night, I was at my office, and mind you, my office at the time was basically a cellar hole somewhere. A former teaching buddy of mine had made all the furniture in the office for us because we couldn't afford to buy it. It was all plywood stuff. I mean, it was really, you know, hand to mouth. And I'm sitting there Sunday night, this particular Sunday night, thinking, if I don't get $5,000 in the bank tomorrow, all sorts of stuff is going to happen because this is going to bounce. I can't pay that artist. And I'm thinking, I can't think of anybody else to borrow money from at this point. The phone rings, it's 10 o'clock. A friend of mine, a teaching buddy of mine from Buffalo, was in New York, and she was there with her boyfriend. Charlie, got to come visit. I said, Stacy, I really can't. I said, no, I got to come over. So I finally go over there, a place in Manhattan. And they said, so what's the big deal? Why are you so upset? I said, I jokingly said, well, because if I don't put $5,000 in the bank tomorrow, I'm up you-know-what creek. And I swear to you, Tommy, Stacy's boyfriend, disappeared into the bedroom for a second, came back and hands me $5,000 in cash and said, we literally just brought this to New York. We sold an insurance policy. I've always thought they probably did a drug deal, but anyway, but whatever it was, he handed me this $5,000. He said, we want to invest it. We'd like to invest it with you. And I literally stuffed it into parts of my body where nobody could get at it and walked home at midnight, took it to the bank in the morning, and that sort of got me through the next couple of weeks. And those things kept happening enough so it's like, okay, somebody wants this to work. And then years later you look back and say, boy, I forgot about all those days. Well, then jumping ahead, you know, that became eventually the management where Bill now works, IMG Artists. And then very briefly, during the 80s, when this company was growing by leaps and bounds, was developing at far greater rate and faster rate than I ever thought it would. In my personal life, it was completely the opposite. It was when the AIDS crisis was really hitting full force. Not that it isn't today, but back in those days, it was, you just didn't understand what was going on. All these people were dying, and friends of mine, my partner, and so it was just, personally, it was a completely different world from professionally. And one was sort of going like this, and the other was tanking. And I can remember talking to a friend of mine, and again, we have these experiences, you don't expect them to happen. And when they do, you just sort of realize, oh, right. And this person looked at me and said, Charlie, why isn't the classical music world more involved in the fight against AIDS? And there had been a couple of one-off events in New York called Music for Life that I'd been involved with, but I was explaining to him, I said, well, I don't think it's that people don't care. I think it's just that nobody's really taken the initiative to get people involved, you know, to be some sort of a catalyst between performing artists and presenters and the field in general to fight for this cause. And as I'm explaining that to him, I suddenly thought, oh, I wonder if I could do that.